Every empire in history swears its money is safe. Every government promises its currency will last forever. But why do we still believe them after thousands of years of proof that none ever have? From Rome's silver denarius to France's assignats, from the Confederate dollar to Lebanon's pound, every so-called stable system has turned to dust. Why? Because the moment trust collapses, the numbers on a piece of paper stop meaning anything. We tell ourselves these events are rare, just freak accidents of history. But what if collapse isn't the exception? What if it's the natural cycle of every financial organism? Economies, just like living creatures, are born, they grow, they decay, and eventually, they die. So why do we keep mistaking their limited lifespan for immortality? Because comfort breeds blindness. When things seem solid and secure, we forget that solidity itself is an illusion built entirely on faith. We look at our bank accounts and feel safe. We see our national currency and assume it's bedrock. But money isn't stone, it's smoke. It only exists as long as everyone agrees it does. Why is that so dangerous? Because when that collective belief breaks, value evaporates faster than fear can spread. History is merciless in showing us this truth, over and over again. Yet that same brutality is useful. It teaches us. Every financial collapse leaves behind a trail of fingerprints, showing who panicked, who planned, and who ultimately survived. And the survivors, they weren't the most optimistic people. They were the early doubters, the ones who started asking questions long before the crowd started screaming. Why does that matter for us, right now? Because we live in a time when faith in paper wealth is once again absolute, and that is precisely when collapse begins to whisper. And that brings us to one of history's most fascinating case studies, the Byzantine Empire. Because if financial collapse is the rule, not the exception, then the real question becomes, who delayed it the longest, and how did they do it? Take the Byzantines. They are often remembered as the eastern half of Rome that somehow managed to survive for 1,000 years after the Western Empire crumbled into ruin. Why did they endure for so long when everyone else fell? Because at the very heart of their empire was a miracle of trust, the gold solidus. For centuries, that coin was so pure, so reliable, that merchants from Europe all the way to Asia accepted it without a second thought. It wasn't just money, it was a universal language of faith. But here's the irony: even the empire that mastered stability couldn't resist its own weakness. You'd think Vedi have learned from Rome's earlier disaster to silver denarius, that emperors kept diluting until it was little more than a piece of tin wearing a silver mask. So why didn't they learn? Because power, by its very nature, is allergic to restraint. The more control a ruler gains, the more they feel compelled to test its limits. So, centuries later, the Byzantines made the exact same fatal mistake, but this time, with gold. They started shaving the purity, mixing in cheaper metals, and stretching the coin thinner. At first, nobody noticed. But trust doesn't die, suddenly it erodes. Slowly. And once that first crack appeared, the solidus once, the global symbol of stability, became just another political illusion. Why does this matter? Because when a government corrupts its money, it corrupts its own credibility. And once that credibility dies, no decree, no army, and no empire can save the system that depends on it. Debasement destroyed Byzantium's financial core from the inside out. Trade collapsed, prices soared. And the economy, that once anchored the entire Mediterranean, turned into a hollow shell of itself. But here's the twist. Not everyone lost. Those who quietly hoarded real, pure gold, or bought land far beyond the emperor's reach, survived. Why? Because real value always escapes manipulation. Governments can mint promises all day long, but they can't counterfeit reality. And that's the first timeless lesson of financial history. Every empire eventually dilutes its money, and every smart survivor learns to hold what empires can't print. But not every collapse comes from rulers tinkering with coins. Sometimes, destruction arrives uninvited, not from greed, but from nature itself. Why does that matter? Because it reminds us that even when humans don't break the system still breaks humans. In the mid-14th century, Europe was hit by something far deadlier than corruption, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, half of Europe's population vanished. Half. Cities emptied, villages disappeared, trade routes fell silent. But here's the strange part. Collapse didn't just destroy, it rearranged power. How? Because when half your labor force dies, labor suddenly becomes gold. Wages soared, workers gained leverage. And for the first time in centuries, peasants could negotiate. It was as if the social pyramid flipped overnight. Food, land, and property, once hoarded by the few, suddenly overflowed into the hands of survivors. A world built on scarcity now overflowed with abundance. But abundance for whom? For those who had liquidity, silver goods, or simply the ability to work? The rules of wealth rewrote themselves. Land that once cost a fortune could be bought for scraps. Houses stood empty, fields begged to be plowed, and those with even a handful of resources stepped into a buyer's market carved out by death. Why is this ancient horror so familiar? Because we've lived through its echo, the COVID pandemic. Supply chains crumbled, governments flooded economies with printed money, and inequality stretched like never before. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Pandemics don't just kill people, they reallocate power. Those with liquidity, cash, assets, or simply access seized opportunities. They bought property when prices dipped, stocks when markets panicked, and businesses when owners gave up. Meanwhile, those living paycheck to paycheck were swept aside by a tidal wave of inflation and insecurity. But why does history keep repeating this cruel pattern? Because crises expose what comfort hides, that wealth isn't just about what you earn. It's about what you can endure. The survivors of the Black Death climbed the ladder because they had reserves when the world ran out of air. The survivors of COVID did the same, not because they were lucky, but because liquidity lets you breathe when everyone else is drowning. So the lesson is brutal, but real. Crises don't create inequality, they amplify it. And every collapse, whether born of kings or of microbes, rewards those who can wait while others are forced to sell. And while pandemics teach us how fast shocks can flip an economy, another story shows us something just as brutal, that institutions can fall just as easily as empires or people. Because if disease reveals fragility in life, banking reveals fragility in trust. Why does that matter? Because every time we say too big to fail, history smirks. Travel back to Renaissance Florence, the financial capital of 14th century Europe. Its skyline glittered with cathedrals funded by gold. Its streets pulsed with merchants who believed they'd built a system immune to collapse. But beneath that confidence was a quiet arrogance, the belief that reputation equals safety. The Bardi and Peruzzi families were giants. Their banks financed kings, popes, and empires. But power makes people forget risk, and profit makes them ignore history. Why? Because when loans are flowing and interest is compounding, the illusion of permanence feels irresistible. Then came Edward III of England, a king addicted to war and debt. He borrowed vast sums to fund his campaigns against France, promising repayment backed by royal honor. But honor doesn't pay interest. And when he defaulted, Florence's entire financial web unraveled. The banks collapsed. Depositors were wiped out. Trade froze. Panic spread. And an entire city that had once dictated the credit terms of Europe suddenly couldn't pay its own bills. But here's the deeper lesson, one that echoes into the 21st century. When the system you trust collapses, it's never just numbers that vanish, it's belief. And belief is the only real currency holding civilization together. Why is that so important? Because the myth of safety is always the prelude to its destruction. Florentine citizens learned the hard way that size is not security, and prestige is not protection. The same illusion resurfaced with Lehman Brothers in 2008, and again when Lebanese banks froze withdrawals in 2019. But why do we keep falling for it? Because humans crave order, and institutions sell the illusion of order better than anyone else. We see their marble buildings, their polished logos, their language of stability, and we mistake appearance for foundation. The truth is simpler and far more unsettling. Institutions exist to profit, not to protect. Their promises last only as long as their incentives do. And when survival demands it, they will sacrifice you to save themselves. So the real survivors in Florence in 2008, and in every crisis since, were never the ones who trusted the system most. They were the ones who prepared for the day it stopped, pretending to care. If Florence taught us that even mighty banks can crumble, then America's own Civil War proved something even darker, that a nation can win on the battlefield, yet lose in its own vault. While we remember the war for its generals and speeches, it was also a financial bloodbath, a chapter most Americans have forgotten. Why does that matter? Because it shows that money itself can become a casualty of war. Both the Union and the Confederacy discovered that cannonballs and cavalry were in their most expensive assets. Trust was wars on that scale demand resources that gold alone just can't cover. So, both sides did the unthinkable. They started printing promises. In the North, these promises took the form of greenbacks, paper money backed not by metal, but by the word of the United States government. At first it seemed patriotic, even innovative. But the more greenbacks Washington printed, the less each one could buy. Prices rose. Faith faltered. The Union survived, just barely, by backing its paper with the ultimate credibility: victory. In the South, however, the story turned apocalyptic. The Confederacy, starved for gold and desperate to fund its war, printed graybacks in monstrous quantities. It seemed clever at first, but when you print faster than you produce, you're not creating wealth, you're diluting reality. By the war's end, Confederate inflation had exploded by thousands of percent. A soldier's monthly pay could barely buy a loaf of bread. A family's entire savings might fit in a sack, but couldn't purchase a single meal. The Confederate dollar didn't just collapse, it died. But amid that death, one truth survived. Value isn't what governments declare, it's what people believe will endure. Land, food, gold, anything tangible became the new measure of survival. Those who held hard assets walked through the storm bruised but breathing. Those who clung to paper promises drowned. This isn't just ancient history, it's a warning carved into America's own soil. The United States has already lived through a currency collapse, teaching a lesson the modern world still refuses to learn. When paper dies, only the real survives. And if the Civil War showed how nations can inflate themselves into collapse, the French Revolution showed how noble ideals can destroy money even faster than an army. In the 1790s, the revolutionaries, drunk on freedom, promised to build a new economy on reason and equality. But ideals don't fund governments, so they issued the assignat, a new currency supposedly backed by seized church property. It sounded ingenious. The land was real, the value measurable. But political virtue doesn't cancel economic gravity. The government printed more and more assignats to fund wars, wages, and welfare. Each new note diluted the last. Prices soared, and the same streets that had once cheered for liberty now screamed for bread. Farmers refused to sell food for worthless paper. Merchants demanded silver. The collapse wasn't just caused by greed. It was driven by faith that patriotism could serve as collateral. But trust has a breaking point. Why is this lesson still so relevant? Because every modern economy is built on that same invisible foundation: belief. The winners of the French collapse weren't the patriots clutching their assignats. They were the realists holding food, gold, or land, things the government couldn't print. The ordinary person learned a brutal lesson. Promises, no matter how righteous, are worth only what others will accept. When that trust breaks, your savings don't just shrink, they evaporate. France didn't just lose its currency, it lost the illusion that morality could replace mathematics. Let's fast forward 2 centuries, and the same lesson hits us again this time. Not in Europe, but in Asia. Because if revolutions destroy money through ideology, global markets can do it with leverage. Why does that matter? Because both are fueled by the same invisible force: trust and stability, and both die the moment that trust runs out. In 1997, it started with a tiny tremor, a speculative attack on the Thai baht. Thailand had borrowed mountains of US dollars, certain its currency peg would hold forever. But why do nations always assume the world will keep believing their promises? Because prosperity makes even the smartest countries forget that confidence isn't permanent. It's rented. When the baht collapsed, the dollar-denominated debt Thailand owed became impossible to pay back. Literally, overnight. And once one domino fell, the rest followed. Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, each currency sinking under the weight of the same shared illusion. But this wasn't just a local disaster. It was a regional firestorm born from a global appetite for risk. Panicked investors fled, economies shrank, unemployment skyrocketed, governments turned to the International Monetary Fund for lifelines. But those lifelines came with chains. Austerity, privatization, surrender. Why? Because in the world of international finance, help is never free, it's just leverage disguised as a rescue. But take a look at who really suffered. It wasn't the Wall Street hedge funds that started the panic. They made fortunes betting on the fall. It was the ordinary citizens, the people whose life savings evaporated, whose mortgages doubled overnight, whose jobs vanished in the wreckage. And yet the pattern was painfully familiar. Those holding dollars or foreign assets survived. Those who trusted their local currency drowned. The 1997 Asian financial crisis wasn't just an economic failure, it was a massive global wealth transfer. Wall Street bought up Asia at a discount. Corporations and hedge funds swooped in, acquiring assets worth billions for just cents on the dollar. It looked like a local collapse, but in truth, it was a carefully engineered redistribution from debtor nations to creditor empires. And that brings us to the oldest rule in financial survival. Debt in someone else's money is a death trap. Because when the storm comes, it isn't the lender who drowns. It's the bear clutching promises that the sea no longer honors. By now, this pattern should feel almost hauntingly familiar. Whether it's revolutionary France, Civil War America, or the Asian crisis of the late 90s. The melody never changes, only the instruments do. Paper money collapses. Debt tightens its noose around nations and families alike. And who are the survivors? They're never the ones who trust blindly in the system. They're the ones who sense its fragility long before the cracks even appear. Now, let's fast forward to something much more recent. Lebanon. 2019. A country that had survived wars, sanctions, and political chaos finally met its silent assassin. A banking collapse. Overnight, citizens woke up to the unthinkable: their own money, locked behind glass doors. But why did this happen? Because Lebanon had borrowed, spent, and promised far more than it could ever deliver. All while pegging its currency to a fantasy of stability. The Lebanese pound lost over 90% of its value. Decades of savings, gone. Imagine working for 30 years, only to realize your entire life's earnings can even buy a week's worth of groceries. People stood outside banks, literally begging to withdraw their own money. What they did, I didn't realize until it was too late, was that their deposits were never truly theirs. How could that be? Because when you put money in a bank, you're not storing wealth, you're lending it. The institution owes you a debt, and in a crisis, they decide if they'll pay you back. That's the brutal truth. Modern finance hides behind polished glass and polite interest rates. The people who survived weren't the richest, they were the wisest. Those who had gold, property, or even just cash under the mattress fared better than those who trusted the system. But you might be thinking, that's Lebanon, not here. We're safe, right? Well, in 2008, Americans watched their homes vanish and pensions disintegrate, while the banks that caused the disaster were rescued with public money. And in 2020, during the pandemic, trillions were printed to keep the machine alive. But what did that really do? It inflated assets for the wealthy, while everyone else's wages stood still. Then came 2023, a year that tore the illusion of safety apart. Regional US banks collapsed almost overnight when confidence cracked. Why? Because the entire banking system runs on one fragile assumption, that not everyone will ask for their money back at the same time. And that's the terrifying truth. Every safe system is only safe until it's not. Every guarantee only exists as long as faith does. History doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. And if you listen closely, you can hear that rhythm getting louder. How do you protect yourself when everything starts to crumble? It's a question older than money itself. And yet, every single generation has to find its own answer. History doesn't just hand you a neat solution, it shows you patterns. Look at Byzantium. For them, protection was gold. Why? Because gold didn't need you to believe in it. It was belief. When trust and everything else dies, only tangible value survives. Then, after the Black Death, a different kind of wealth emerged: liquidity. The people who came out on top were the ones who could buy up abandoned land while everyone else was just trying to survive. Why liquidity? Because opportunity loves to hide in the middle of a panic. And only those with ready resources can see through the smoke and seize it. Fast forward to Florence. The key there was mistrust, not of people, but of institutions that seemed too big to fail, right until they did. In the American Confederacy, it was all about hard goods. Tools, food, ammunition, things you could actually use and trade when paper money became worthless. In Asia, a crucial lesson was learned. Avoid debt, especially debt in someone else's currency, because when things get rough, power always flows back to the lender. And in modern Lebanon, survival meant one simple, brutal thing: getting out before the doors slam shut. The patterns shift, the settings change, but the core theme is eternal. Survival doesn't belong to those who blindly trust the system. It belongs to those who see the cracks forming. And here's where it gets interesting. A collapse is both a tragedy and a massive opportunity. Why? Because destruction clears the ground for something new. For the unprepared, it's total ruin. But for those who are aware, it's the sale of the century. After the Black Death, peasants became landowners. After the 2008 financial crisis, people with cash on hand bought homes for pennies on the dollar, while millions lost theirs. So, you see, protection isn't just about defense. It's about positioning. It's about being ready to catch what others, under immense pressure, are forced to let go of. But let's go even deeper. Because true wealth isn't just about what you own, it's about what you can do. And this is critical. In a collapse, money can die, but utility usefulness lives on. The baker who can still make bread, the craftsman who can fix things, the farmer who can grow food, the merchant who can move goods through the chaos. These people weren't just survivors, they were the architects of the new order. Every collapse rewrites the rules of value. Paper promises fade, skills endure. Assets that are grounded in reality, things like land, food, energy, and the ability to create always reclaim their throne. And that's the brutal yet liberating truth of it all. Every crisis is a transfer of wealth. It's a transfer from the many who trusted the old system to the few who prepared for the new one. From paper promises to tangible value. From passive savers to active builders. So the real question isn't if everything will fall apart. History shows us it always does, in cycles. The real question is, when it happens, will you be left clutching worthless promises? Or will you be holding something real? History doesn't repeat itself, but it does warn us. Ignore those warnings, and it won't just whisper, it will crush you. If this changed how you see the world, make sure you subscribe. Because history has already written the answers. I'm just here to show you where to find them. Thanks for watching.